The jungle breathed in the heat. It was February 19, 1945, and the black sand of Iwo Jima shimmered under the pale morning sun, still cool to the touch before the day's inferno would begin. The waves rolled in with a rhythm that had repeated itself for 10,000 years, indifferent to the flotilla of gray steel vessels anchored just beyond the surf line. In the pre-dawn darkness, young men, American Marines mostly between 18 and 22, stood packed in the holds of landing craft, their breath visible in the cold Pacific air, their hands gripping rifles slick with salt spray. They did not speak much. The metallic smell of diesel fuel mixed with vomit and sweat. Somewhere in the distance, the first shells began to thunder from the naval guns, a sound so deep it seemed to come from beneath the ocean floor itself. Across the volcanic island, dug into 15 miles of interconnected tunnels and reinforced bunkers carved from the island's black rock, 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited. They had been waiting for months. Many had not seen daylight in weeks. They lived like moles, breathing recycled air thick with sulfur from the island's volcanic vents, eating cold rice mixed with pickled radish, rationing water so severely that some men had not bathed in 40 days. Their uniforms hung loose on frames thinned by dysentery and malnutrition. In the officers' quarters deep beneath Mount Suribachi, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had written what he believed would be his final letter to his wife. He folded it carefully, placed it inside a waterproof pouch, and tucked it into his tunic. He did not expect it to reach her. He did not expect to see March. But what sustained these men? What kept them in those dark tunnels despite the starvation, the disease, the knowledge that no reinforcements would come, was a belief that had been drilled into them since childhood, reinforced through years of military indoctrination, and seemingly validated by early war victories across Asia and the Pacific. It was a belief in Japanese spiritual superiority, a belief that the Americans, for all their machinery and material wealth, were soft, weak, corrupted by luxury and individualism, that they lacked the Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, the willingness to sacrifice everything, to endure any hardship, to die with honor rather than surrender. Japanese training manuals distributed to soldiers in 1944 explicitly stated that American troops lack fighting spirit and will retreat when faced with determined resistance and heavy casualties. Intelligence reports claimed that American forces depended entirely on overwhelming firepower because their soldiers were too cowardly for close combat. One widely circulated propaganda pamphlet described Americans as mongrel race of pleasure seekers who will abandon their positions at the first sight of blood. This was not mere rhetoric. This was doctrine. And for the soldiers huddled in Iwo Jima's tunnels, it was also hope. The belief had roots that stretched back decades, woven into the fabric of Japanese imperial ideology that had emerged during the Meiji Restoration and intensified through the militaristic fervor of the 1930s. After Japan's stunning victory over Russia in 1905, the first time in modern history that an Asian power had defeated a European empire, a sense of cultural and spiritual exceptionalism took hold in the Japanese consciousness. This was magnified by the seeming ease with which Japanese forces had conquered Manchuria in 1931, invaded China in 1937, and then, in the devastating opening moves of the Pacific War, destroyed the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, and overrun American positions in the Philippines, British holdings in Malaya and Singapore, and Dutch territories in the East Indies, all within 6 months. To the Japanese military establishment, these victories confirmed what their ideology had always promised, that spiritual strength trumped material advantage, that the Western powers, for all their industrial might, were fundamentally decadent. Japanese newspapers in 1942 printed cartoons showing fat American soldiers running away from disciplined Japanese troops. Radio broadcasts mocked American softness and predicted their inevitable defeat once Japanese forces demonstrated true Bushido, the way of the warrior. In training camps across Japan and occupied territories, recruits were taught to view death in battle not as tragedy, but as transcendence, a glorious culmination of duty to emperor and nation. Meanwhile, American prisoners of war captured in the Philippines and elsewhere were paraded, starved, and beaten, their suffering presented as evidence of Western weakness when stripped of their machines. But beneath this confident exterior, by 1945, cracks had begun to show. The tide had turned at Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk in a single day, a blow from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. Guadalcanal had revealed that Americans could endure jungle warfare. The island-hopping campaign had demonstrated American industrial capacity to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese soldiers had witnessed for the first time the full fury of American combined arms. Doctrine, naval bombardment that turned defensive positions into moonscapes, aerial bombardment so sustained it blocked out the sky, and then the infantry, supported by tanks and flamethrowers, advancing with methodical, terrible efficiency. Of the 31,000 Japanese defenders on Saipan, all but a few hundred died. Those few survivors brought back stories that contradicted everything the propaganda had promised. They spoke of an enemy that did not break, that came in waves, that seemed endless, that called in fire from ships and planes with casual precision, that fought with a coldness more terrifying than any banzai charge. But even these reports, filtered through the military hierarchy, could not fully prepare the defenders of Iwo Jima for what was about to arrive on their beach. The American armada that approached Iwo Jima that February morning represented the accumulated industrial might of a nation that had spent 4 years transforming itself into what historians would later call the arsenal of democracy. 450 ships, more than 70,000 assault troops in the initial waves, with another 40,000 in reserve. Among them were elements of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, units that had been training specifically for this operation for months, studying intelligence reports, running rehearsals on islands configured to match Iwo Jima's terrain, learning new tactics for clearing fortified positions. They brought with them equipment that existed nowhere else on Earth in such quantities. M4 Sherman tanks modified with flamethrowers capable of spraying burning napalm 200 feet. LVT Amtraks, amphibious tractors that could crawl directly from ship to shore and then across the beach, delivering troops and supplies while under fire. Bulldozers armored against small arms fire, designed to flatten bunkers and bury cave entrances. And new weapons like the M2 flamethrower, a portable unit strapped to a man's back holding compressed nitrogen and 4 gallons of thickened gasoline that could incinerate everything within 50 yards. Behind them, in the holds of cargo vessels, sat mountains of supplies calculated down to the last bandage and bullet. 17 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 100,000 gallons of fresh water per day, 70,000 ration packs, 12,000 plasma units for blood transfusions, morphine syrettes counted in the tens of thousands, and enough fuel to keep tanks, flamethrowers, generators, and vehicles running continuously for weeks. American logistics officers had calculated that each Marine would require 60 pounds of supplies per day to sustain combat operations. The supply chain to deliver this stretched back across 6,000 miles of ocean to depots in Hawaii, California, and ultimately to factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and 1,000 other cities where workers, many of them women who had taken the places of men now fighting overseas, worked in shifts around the clock, producing the rifles, ammunition, rations, vehicles, and equipment that flowed in an unbroken stream toward the Pacific. This was not merely quantitative superiority. It represented a fundamentally different conception of warfare, where Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit, endurance, and the willingness to fight to the death with whatever resources were available. American doctrine, refined through the hard lessons of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan, emphasized systematic destruction of enemy defenses through overwhelming combined firepower, followed by infantry assaults supported by armor and flamethrowers, with continuous resupply that allowed assaults to continue without pause. If a bunker could not be taken by rifle fire, call in mortars. If mortars failed, bring up tanks. If tanks could not penetrate, use flamethrowers. If flamethrowers were insufficient, bulldoze the entrance shut and entomb the defenders. And if casualties mounted, Fresh troops would be brought forward because the United States, alone among the combatants in World War II, had the capacity to simultaneously wage industrial-scale war in Europe and the Pacific, while its civilian population experienced, remarkably, an increase in standard of living. This was the machinery, both literal and organizational, that began landing on Iwo Jima's beaches that February morning. And it was this machinery that would shatter every preconception the Japanese defenders held about American weakness. The first Marines hit the beach at 9:02 a.m. The volcanic sand, composed of fine black ash, provided no traction. Men sank to their ankles with each step. The beach rose in a series of 15-foot terraces, almost impossible to climb while carrying 60-pound packs. For the first hour, there was almost no resistance. Japanese commanders, learning from previous battles where defenders had been slaughtered by naval bombardment while manning beach defenses, had positioned their forces inland in the tunnels and bunkers, waiting until the beach was crowded with men and vehicles before opening fire. At 10:15 a.m., as the eighth wave of Marines struggled up the terraces, the entire island seemed to explode. Artillery shells, mortars, and machine gun fire erupted simultaneously from positions that had remained invisible during weeks of pre-invasion bombardment. Men were cut down in clusters. Wounded Marines crawled toward cover that didn't exist. The black sand turned red. Amtraks burst into flames. The carefully orchestrated landing plan dissolved into chaos as units became intermingled, as communications broke down, as the shocking intensity of Japanese fire threatened to drive the invasion back into the sea. This was the moment Japanese defenders had trained for. This was when the Americans would break, when their softness would be revealed, when they would retreat to their ships and abandon the assault, as Japanese doctrine predicted they must. They did not retreat. Instead, they called in the ships. Within minutes, naval gunfire support coordinators, officers trained specifically for this role, began directing fire from the offshore fleet. Battleships and cruisers positioned just miles offshore began walking their shells inland, targeting the sources of Japanese fire with precision that stunned the defenders. Simultaneously, carrier aircraft swept over the island, bombing and strafing any position that revealed itself by firing. The Americans were not breaking. They were adapting, and they were doing so with a speed and coordination that Japanese defenders, trained for individual valor and small unit tactics, could not match. By nightfall on that first day, 30,000 Marines had landed. 2,500 were dead or wounded. But the beachhead held, and more critically, the supply chain was functioning. Even as Japanese artillery continued to rain down on the beach, Navy Seabees construction battalions were bulldozing roads through the sand, laying metal matting for vehicles, establishing supply dumps, setting up aid stations. Amtrak shuttled continuously between ships and shore, bringing ammunition, water, food, medical supplies, and fresh troops. Wounded Marines were evacuated back to hospital ships where surgeons operated under lights powered by generators, using plasma and whole blood flown in from the United States, employing surgical techniques that would save men who would have died of shock and blood loss in any previous war. In his command bunker deep beneath the island's central plateau, General Kuribayashi listened to reports from his subordinates. The Americans had not been driven off. They had not even paused. Despite casualties that should have broken any assault, they had continued landing troops and supplies throughout the day. The volume of fire they could bring to bear, from ships, planes, and their own artillery being dragged ashore, exceeded anything in Japanese experience. And now, as night fell, instead of the confusion and vulnerability Japanese forces had exploited in previous battles, the Americans maintained organized perimeters, illuminated the approaches with starshells, and responded to any probe with overwhelming firepower. Some officers reported that American positions were being resupplied at night under fire, with a regularity that seemed impossible. How could they have so much of everything? The answer was unfolding not just on Iwo Jima but across the Pacific, in a supply chain of staggering complexity. At Pearl Harbor, depot ships were loading the supplies that would reach Iwo Jima in 5 days. In San Francisco, cargo vessels were taking on the supplies that would arrive in 2 weeks. In factories across the American Midwest, workers were producing the ammunition that would be fired on Iwo Jima in March. This pipeline, once filled, flowed continuously, almost autonomously, driven by logistics officers who tracked every crate, Every gallon of fuel, every ration pack through a system of paperwork and organization that was itself a kind of weapon, invisible to the enemy, unromantic, unspoken of in propaganda, but absolutely decisive. Japanese soldiers had been trained to view supply as a personal burden. Each man carried what he needed, foraged when possible and endured when food ran out. This was presented as a virtue, evidence of spiritual strength, but it was in practice a catastrophic weakness. Japanese forces across the Pacific were starving not because of spirit, but because their supply system had collapsed. The American submarine blockade had strangled Japan's merchant fleet. The ships that did make it through carried supplies for the home islands, not for the scattered garrisons. On Iwo Jima, defenders had received their last supply shipment in December. They had been on reduced rations since January. By February, many were eating half a bowl of rice per day, supplemented with weeds and roots dug from the island's volcanic soil. They had no air support. The Japanese Air Force had been bled white in the Philippines and could spare nothing for Iwo Jima. They had limited artillery ammunition, with strict orders to fire only at targets of opportunity. They had no expectation of resupply, no hope of reinforcement, no illusion of rescue. What they had was the bunker complex, a marvel of military engineering that represented months of labor. Tunnels connected hundreds of defensive positions, allowing defenders to move unseen beneath American bombardment, to pop up, fire, and retreat into the earth before counterfire arrived. Pillboxes made of reinforced concrete, buried under layers of sand and rock, impervious to anything but direct hits from the largest naval guns. Spider holes, individual fighting positions barely large enough for one man, nearly invisible, from which a soldier could fire and then seal himself in, becoming effectively a suicide weapon, trading his life for a few American casualties. This network had been designed by Kuribayashi, one of Japan's most innovative commanders, specifically to bleed the Americans, to make them pay in casualties for every yard, to turn Iwo Jima into a battle so costly that American public opinion might waver, might question whether the island, barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock, was worth the price. But Kuribayashi, unlike many of his peers, harbored no illusions about American weakness. He had served as a military attaché in the United States in the 1920s, had traveled across the country, had seen the factories, the infrastructure, the casual abundance that ordinary Americans took for granted. He had written home to his wife about American industrial capacity, about the danger of underestimating such a power. His defensive plan for Iwo Jima was premised not on Japanese spiritual superiority, but on cold mathematics. If his 21,000 men could inflict 25,000 American casualties, perhaps that would be enough. Not to win, victory was impossible, but to delay, to raise the price. To demonstrate that the path to Japan's home islands would be paved with an unacceptable cost in American blood. The defenses were formidable. The Japanese soldiers manning them were among the best trained, most indoctrinated, most willing to die in the entire Imperial Army. But they were about to encounter something their training had not prepared them for, something that would unravel not just their defensive positions, but their entire understanding of warfare. It began on the third day, February 23rd, when Marine engineers brought forward the first of the flamethrower tanks. These were M4 Sherman tanks modified with a flame projector replacing the main gun, capable of shooting a jet of napalm, thickened gasoline that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, across distances up to 150 feet. The tactical doctrine was simple. Identify a Japanese bunker or cave entrance, maneuver the tank into position, and incinerate everything inside. The psychological impact was something else entirely. Corporal Yasuda Takeshi, a machine gunner positioned in a bunker facing north toward the second airfield, recorded in his diary, later recovered from his body, the first time he witnessed the flamethrower in action. It was mid-morning. His position, a reinforced concrete pillbox with 4 feet of earth piled on top, had weathered 2 days of shelling with minimal damage. Through his firing slit, he could see American Marines advancing in small groups, using craters for cover, calling in mortar fire on any position that revealed itself. His orders were strict: fire only when targets massed, conserve ammunition. He watched as a group of Marines approached a cave entrance 70 yards to his left, a position manned by 12 Japanese soldiers under Lieutenant Ono. The Marines took cover. Then a tank, not a regular tank but something with a strange projector, rolled forward. There was a whooshing sound and a tongue of fire, impossibly bright even in daylight, shot from the tank into the cave entrance. The flame seemed to bend in midair, seeking the opening, then disappeared inside. For perhaps 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the cave entrance, from cracks in the rock, from a ventilation hole 20 feet away. 4 Japanese soldiers stumbled out, their uniforms on fire, screaming. Marine riflemen shot them down. The tank moved on. Lieutenant Ono and the others inside never emerged. Later, when Marines entered the cave, they found the bodies huddled in the deepest recess, 50 feet from the entrance. They had died from asphyxiation. The fire had consumed all the oxygen in the sealed space. Corporal Yasuda wrote, "The Americans have brought a devil weapon. It does not matter how brave we are. It does not matter that we are willing to die. When the fire comes into the tunnel, there is no defense. No spirit can stand against it. We cannot even face the enemy who kills us. We can only wait in the dark and burn." This was the crack in the ideology. The flamethrower, and the bulldozer, and the systematic combined arms tactics, and above all the endless supply of men and materiel, revealed that spiritual strength, however genuine, was insufficient against industrial warfare waged by an enemy with unlimited resources and a doctrine that emphasized not honor or individual valor, but efficient killing. The Marines were not interested in banzai charges or hand-to-hand combat. They were interested in destroying defensive positions with the minimum casualties to themselves, and they had developed the tools and tactics to do exactly that. The flamethrower became the symbol, the recurring motif that would haunt Japanese accounts of Iwo Jima and subsequent battles. It appeared in prisoner interrogations, in diaries, in letters that soldiers wrote knowing they would never be sent. Not because it was the most lethal weapon the Americans employed. Artillery and aerial bombing killed far more, but because it was the most visceral representation of the asymmetry. A Japanese soldier, no matter how well trained or ideologically committed, could not fight fire. He could stand against bullets, could rush machine gun positions in suicidal charges, could starve and endure and die with honor. But when the napalm came, there was no Bushido answer. There was only burning. The Marines employed flamethrowers with clinical efficiency. The standard tactic, a 6-man demolition team would approach a suspected Japanese position covered by riflemen. A Marine with a portable flamethrower, the M2, which weighed 70 pounds fully loaded and had an effective range of 50 feet, would advance to within range, often crawling, while his teammates provided suppressing fire. He would fire a sustained burst of 4 to 6 seconds, emptying nearly half his fuel tanks into the position. If defenders emerged, riflemen would cut them down. If they didn't, engineers would move forward with satchel charges, canvas bags, stuffed with 20 pounds of explosives, toss them into the cave or bunker, take cover, and detonate them. If that failed to collapse the position, they would bring up a bulldozer and simply bury the entrance, entombing whoever was inside. Then the team would move to the next position, and the next, methodically, without haste or anger, like men clearing a field of stumps. Private First Class Robert Leckie, who served with the 1st Marine Division on other islands but whose account of Pacific combat captures the mindset, wrote, "We were not cruel men, but we had learned that mercy was a luxury we could not afford. The Japanese did not surrender. Every position had to be destroyed, every cave sealed, every defender killed. It was not personal. It was the job. You flamed a bunker, moved to the next one. You did not think about who was inside. You could not. If you did, you would go mad." This industrial approach to killing, systematic, dispassionate, organized, was itself a kind of American characteristic, though not the weakness Japanese propaganda had predicted. American forces fought like they built cars, with standardized procedures, specialized tools, division of labor, and quality control. There were manuals for everything. Training was designed to make complex tasks routine. Soldiers were cogs in a machine, yes, but the machine worked. When a Marine with a flamethrower was killed, another stepped forward. When supplies ran low, more arrived from the beach. When a tank was destroyed, another rolled forward. The individual American soldier might indeed be softer, less ideologically committed, less willing to die than his Japanese counterpart. But that individual was embedded in a system that amplified his effectiveness 100-fold. And that system was fed by abundance that to the Japanese was incomprehensible. By the end of the first week on Iwo Jima, Marines on the front lines were eating hot meals cooked on the beach and carried forward to foxholes in insulated containers. They had coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute Japanese soldiers drank. They had cigarettes, free, distributed in ration packs, so plentiful that Marines used them as trade goods or simply smoked them constantly to mask the smell of death. They had morphine for the wounded, plasma for those in shock, sulfa drugs to prevent infection, whole blood for surgery. The aid stations on the beach looked like field hospitals, with X-ray machines powered by generators, surgical teams working, in tents, ambulances, converted jeeps, shuttling wounded from the front lines to the beach and then to hospital ships, where recovery wards had clean sheets, hot food, nurses, and a survival rate that would have been miraculous in any previous war. Wounded Japanese soldiers, by contrast, received minimal medical care. Japanese military doctrine viewed excessive care for the wounded as a waste of resources that should go to able-bodied fighters. Seriously wounded men were expected to commit suicide, either through grenade or by having a comrade shoot them, rather than burden the unit. Medical supplies were almost non-existent by the second week of battle. A Japanese soldier shot in the abdomen had essentially no chance of survival. Those who could not walk were left in the tunnels with a grenade and a suggestion. The contrast was not lost on those Japanese soldiers who survived long enough to see American aid stations. Several prisoners of war, interrogated after capture, often men so badly wounded they could not kill themselves and were overrun by advancing Marines, expressed shock at the level of medical care they received. One, a sergeant who had lost both legs to a tank round, told his interrogators through a translator that he had expected to be executed immediately upon capture. Instead, he had been given morphine for the pain, his wounds bandaged, plasma started, and was evacuated to a hospital ship where American surgeons operated on him. He survived. He would spend the rest of the war in a POW camp in Hawaii, where he would be fed 3 meals a day, allowed to write letters, given medical care, and treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. When asked what surprised him most about the Americans, he replied, "That you waste so much on the defeated. In our army I would have been given a grenade and left. Here, you spent medicine, doctor time, ship space, to save an enemy who can never fight you again. I do not understand this." What he was encountering was not softness but a different value system, rooted in the American cultural expectation that life, even enemy life, had intrinsic worth, that resources existed to be used for humanitarian purposes, that winning the war did not require becoming as brutal as the enemy. This was not universal. There were instances of Marines refusing to take prisoners, of wounded Japanese soldiers being shot rather than evacuated, of casual brutality born from months of combat against an enemy that fought with suicidal fanaticism. War is dehumanizing, and the Pacific War was particularly savage. But the baseline American approach, reflected in doctrine and usually in practice, was that prisoners should be taken when possible, wounded cared for, and that overwhelming firepower should be used to minimize American casualties, which also, incidentally, minimized Japanese casualties by shortening the battle. The Japanese military had no conceptual framework for this. Their training emphasized that capture was the ultimate dishonor, that death was preferable, that the enemy would torture and kill prisoners. When prisoners were not tortured, when they were instead treated with medical care and adequate food, it created cognitive dissonance. Some became cooperative, providing intelligence. Others retreated into silence, unable to reconcile the reality with everything they had been taught. But almost all, in their interrogations, mentioned the abundance, the food, the medicine, the supplies that seemed limitless, By the third week of the battle, Marines had fought their way to the central plateau, and the battle devolved into a grinding cave-by-cave, bunker-by-bunker destruction of the Japanese defensive network. Progress was measured in yards per day. Casualties mounted. On February 28th, the 28th Marines reported that after 9 days of combat, they had suffered 50% casualties, roughly 1,600 men killed or wounded out of a regiment of 3,000. Replacements arrived, fresh. Troops ferried from transports to shore, given a brief orientation, and sent forward. The machine continued. In the tunnels, Japanese soldiers faced a choice that was not really a choice. They could remain underground, where eventually the Americans would seal the entrances or pump in fire or simply bulldoze them into tombs. They could attempt to infiltrate American lines at night. But the Marines had become expert at defending their positions, using flares, coordinated fields of fire, and a willingness to shoot at anything that moved in the dark. Or they could make a final charge, a banzai attack, though Kuribayashi had explicitly forbidden wasteful banzai charges, insisting his men sell their lives as expensively as possible through defensive fighting. But discipline was breaking down. Units cut off from command, starving out of ammunition, with wounded who were dying slowly in the dark, began making attacks not because they thought they would break through, but because dying in a charge seemed more honorable than being buried alive. These charges failed. Every one of them. American positions, alerted by sentries and illuminated by flares, would open fire with machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery. The Japanese attackers, brave and determined and doomed, would be cut down in waves. In the morning, American burial details would count the bodies, sometimes 50, sometimes 200, and Marines would shake their heads at the waste. There was no glory in it from the American perspective, only a grim confirmation that the enemy would not surrender, that every position would have to be taken the hard way. March 4th, 1945. A Marine squad, part of the 5th Division, was tasked with clearing a series of bunkers on the northwest corner of the island. The area was honeycombed with caves and spider holes, and progress had been slow. The flamethrower operator, a PFC from Ohio, approached a cave entrance. He fired a burst of napalm into the opening. The flame disappeared inside. He waited for the smoke to clear, then advanced cautiously to the entrance to check if the position was clear. As he leaned forward, a Japanese soldier, his uniform on fire, stumbled out of the cave and tackled him. Both men went down. The Marine squad mates shot the Japanese soldier, but not before the burning man had set the flamethrower operator's fuel tanks alight. The PFC died in seconds, screaming, as the napalm on his back ignited. The squad withdrew, shaken. They called in a demolition team, which collapsed the cave entrance with explosives, entombing whoever else was inside. Later, when engineers excavated the position to ensure it was fully destroyed, they found 12 Japanese soldiers dead from asphyxiation, and one, the one who had attacked the Marine, partially burned. He had wrapped his head and hands in wet cloth before charging out, a desperate improvisation to survive the flames long enough to reach the enemy. It hadn't saved him, but he had managed to take one American with him. His name was never recorded. He became one of the 21,000 Japanese dead on Iwo Jima, a statistic in a battle where the defenders achieved Kuribayashi's goal of bleeding the Americans but could not change the outcome. The symbolism here is the flamethrower itself, not as a tool but as the embodiment of industrial warfare's indifference to individual valor. In traditional combat, a brave man could make a difference. A samurai with a sword could defeat multiple opponents through skill and spirit. Even in modern warfare, a well-positioned machine gunner or a skilled sniper could hold up an advance. But against a weapon that filled your bunker with fire, that consumed the air you breathed, that could be operated by a 19-year-old kid from a farm in Iowa who had been trained for 6 weeks, individual prowess meant nothing. The flamethrower reduced warfare to physics and chemistry, combustion, oxygen depletion, heat transfer. It was impersonal, efficient, and utterly devastating, and it was backed by a supply chain that could deliver as much napalm as needed, as many replacement flamethrowers, as many trained operators. This was the American way of war that Japanese ideology had failed to account for. The weakness was not lack of spirit, but an unwillingness to die for symbolism. Americans would not make banzai charges because banzai charges were tactically idiotic. They would not starve in silence because supply systems existed to feed them. They would not fight to the last man in positions that were already lost because there was no honor in pointless death, only waste. But this pragmatism, this willingness to use material resources to substitute for sacrifice, made them not weaker, but far more lethal. A Japanese soldier might be willing to die 10 times over, but he could only die once. An American soldier, backed by industrial might, could kill 10 times over without dying at all. March 16, 1945. The 3rd Marine Division reported that organized Japanese resistance in their sector had ceased. That same day, Marines reached the northern tip of the island. Iwo Jima was declared secure, though fighting would continue in isolated pockets for another 2 weeks, and the last Japanese holdouts would not be killed or captured until late March. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, the iconic photograph taken on February 23rd, had already become a symbol back home, appearing in newspapers across America, a moment of triumph in a battle that was still killing Marines every day. The cost: 6,121 Americans killed, 19,217 wounded. Nearly 27,000 casualties to take an island 8 square miles in size. It was the only battle in the Pacific War where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties, a testament to the ferocity of the defense. But it was also a battle that demonstrated the unsustainability of Japanese strategy. Yes, they had inflicted terrible losses. Yes, American newspapers had published stories questioning whether Iwo Jima was worth the price. But the Americans had taken the island. They had absorbed the casualties, buried their dead, evacuated their wounded, and within weeks would use Iwo Jima's airfields to base the P-51 Mustang fighters that would escort B-29 bombers on raids over Japan's home islands. Raids that would burn Japanese cities to ash. Raids that would culminate in August with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. General Kuribayashi died in the final days of the battle, killed in action leading one of the last organized counterattacks. His body was never found. Before his death, he sent a final message to Imperial headquarters. The situation is now critical. The enemy has gained control of most of the island. My officers and men have fought well, but the enemy's material superiority is overwhelming. We cannot hold out much longer. It was an epitaph not just for Iwo Jima, but for the entire Japanese war effort. An acknowledgement that spirit, however strong, could not prevail against the industrial and organizational might of a fully mobilized America. In the aftermath, American military analysts studied the battle extensively. The tactics refined on Iwo Jima: combined arms assaults, flamethrower and demolition teams, artillery coordination, armor support would be used again on Okinawa, the next and final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. The logistics network would be expanded, the supply chain made even more robust. The lessons were clear: overwhelming firepower, continuous supply, systematic destruction of defenses, and a willingness to expend material rather than men whenever possible. This was warfare as engineering problem, and American forces had the tools and resources to solve it. For Japanese soldiers and civilians, Iwo Jima marked a transformation in perception. The propaganda about American weakness could no longer be sustained. Survivors told stories, not of American cowardice, but of machines, of endless supplies, of an enemy that fought with cold efficiency. The kamikaze pilots who struck at American ships were told they were Japan's last hope, that their spiritual dedication would overcome material disadvantage. But even as they dove their planes into carriers and destroyers, American damage control teams, trained specifically for this, would extinguish fires, patch holes, and often have the ships back in action within days. American shipyards were producing new carriers faster than kamikazes could sink them. By mid-1945, the truth was unavoidable. Japan was not losing because its soldiers lacked spirit. It was losing because it was fighting an enemy with a population twice as large, an industrial base 10 times greater, and a cultural and political system that could mobilize those resources with devastating efficiency. The final irony was that the very abundance and pragmatism Japanese propaganda had mocked as weakness was, in fact, America's greatest strength. The willingness to supply troops with hot meals, to evacuate wounded, to spend resources keeping soldiers alive and effective, created a force that could sustain years of combat across 2 oceans without collapsing. The industrial capacity that produced not just weapons but creature comforts, cigarettes, Coca-Cola, even ice cream makers installed on Navy ships, was the same capacity that produced 50,000 tanks, 90,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of shipping. The democracy that Japanese militarists viewed as chaotic and inefficient had mobilized 16 million men and women into uniform and turned the entire nation into a war economy without requiring a dictatorship or secret police to enforce compliance. In a very real sense, the flamethrowers and bulldozers that terrified Japanese soldiers were symbols of something deeper. A society rich enough to equip every soldier with the best tools, organized enough to deliver those tools to the front lines, and pragmatic enough to use them without romantic illusions about the glory of combat. Where Japanese doctrine taught that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, American practice demonstrated that material advantage, properly organized and ruthlessly applied, could make spiritual strength irrelevant. This was the truth that was learned in the tunnels of Iwo Jima, in the jungles of Guadalcanal and Saipan, in the waters of Leyte Gulf, where the remnants of the Japanese fleet made its final sortie and was annihilated by American naval power so overwhelming that it was less a battle than an execution. By the time B-29 bombers were firebombing Tokyo, by the time American submarines had reduced Japan's merchant fleet to a handful of rusting hulks, by the time American forces were preparing for the invasion of the home islands, an invasion that was rendered unnecessary by the atomic bomb, the illusion of American weakness had been incinerated as thoroughly as the defenders in those bunkers, what Japanese soldiers called. Americans in the final year of the war was not weak, but devils and machines. They spoke of enemies who seemed never to tire, never to run out of ammunition, never to stop coming. This was not admiration. It was fear mixed with incomprehension. How could a nation of soft, individualistic, pleasure-seeking people fight with such mechanical efficiency? The answer was that the premise was wrong. Americans were not soft. They were practical. They saw no virtue in dying when living and killing the enemy was an option. They saw no shame in using machines to do what human muscle could do less efficiently. They understood that wars were won not by the side with the most courage, but by the side that could bring the most force to bear at the decisive point. And they had built a society, imperfect, at times chaotic, but dynamically productive, that could generate that force on a scale unprecedented in history. In the end, the transformation was complete. The Japanese soldiers who entered the war believing in their spiritual superiority died still believing it, perhaps, but no longer believing it mattered. The few who survived, who were captured or who surrendered in the final days after the Emperor's radio broadcast, emerged into a world where American occupation forces arrived not with vengeance but with food aid, with medicine, with reconstruction plans, where the victors, having demonstrated their capacity for industrial-scale destruction, now demonstrated an equal capacity for industrial-scale rebuilding. This, too, was incomprehensible within the framework of Japanese militarism. You destroyed your enemy utterly. You did not then feed his children and rebuild his cities. But that was the American paradox. A nation capable of terrible violence and also terrible generosity, both springing from the same root of abundance and pragmatism. The flamethrowers and the food aid were two sides of the same coin, a civilization that had resources to spare, whether for killing or for mercy, and that chose which to deploy based not on ideology but on effectiveness. In war you destroyed, in peace you rebuilt, both with the same systematic efficiency. Years later, historians would debate whether the Pacific War could have ended differently, whether Japan might have sued for peace earlier if terms had been clearer, whether the atomic bombs were necessary. These are questions worth asking. But from the perspective of the soldiers who fought, American Marines crawling across volcanic rock under fire, Japanese defenders starving in dark tunnels, the answer was already clear by Iwo Jima. One side had the capacity to continue indefinitely, to replace losses, to adapt tactics, to bring ever greater force to bear. The other side had courage and discipline and willingness to die, and none of it was enough. The poetic truth, the epilogue written in smoke and ash, is this: strength is not measured by willingness to suffer, but by capacity to endure suffering and still function. A man who dies bravely has demonstrated courage but has removed himself from the fight. A man who survives, who retreats when necessary, who uses tools and tactics and teamwork to win while minimizing his own risk, is not weak. He is effective. And in the calculus of industrial warfare, effectiveness is everything. The flamethrower did not merely kill Japanese soldiers. It killed the ideology that had sustained them. It revealed that there is no spiritual answer to material force, that Bushido cannot stop napalm, that honor is a luxury reserved for those who can afford it. America in 1945 could afford many things: honor, mercy, generosity, and also the production of tools of war on a scale that dwarfed any other nation. That abundance was not a sign of decadence but of power. Power channeled through democracy and capitalism, an industrial organization into a force that could fight on two fronts, defeat two empires and then rebuild both. The Japanese soldiers were not wrong to fight for their beliefs, but they were catastrophically wrong to underestimate an enemy simply because that enemy valued life over death, comfort over hardship, pragmatism over ideology. Those values, it turned out, were not weaknesses. They were the foundation of a strength that could be quantified in ships and tanks and aircraft and rations and medical supplies and flamethrowers, all delivered to the right place at the right time, in quantities sufficient to overwhelm any defense, no matter how brave, and that is the lesson etched in black sand and volcanic rock, whispered in the ruins of bunkers and the silence of mass graves. That freedom, when backed by abundance and organized by competence, is the most powerful force on earth. Not because it makes men fearless, fear is rational, but because it gives them the tools to fight smart, the resources to sustain the fight, and the hope that survival is possible. That hope makes men more effective soldiers than any fatalistic death cult ever could. Iwo Jima was where the illusion died. Where Japanese soldiers called Americans weak and then watched them come, wave after wave, backed by ships and planes and tanks and flamethrowers, supplied and fed and supported by a nation that could wage total war, while its citizens at home still drank Coca-Cola and went to movies. That dissonance between the propaganda and the reality was the final crushing defeat, not just of Japan's military, but of the ideology that had sent those men to die in tunnels on a worthless rock in the middle of the Pacific. The abundance was not incidental. It was the point. It was the proof that democracy and capitalism, for all their flaws, could mobilize resources and human effort on a scale that centralized militarism could not match. That the land of the free was also the land of the plenty, and that plenty could be transformed into power, terrible, unstoppable power, when the cause was just and the will was there. The flamethrowers and bulldozers and endless supplies were not signs of weakness. They were the tools of a nation that had learned to fight not with its heart, but with its head, not with spirit, but with systems, not with individual heroism, but with collective might. And in the end, that made all the difference. The war ended not with a glorious last stand, but with 2 mushroom clouds, with surrender signed on the deck of a battleship, with occupation by an army of Americans who arrived with chewing gum and chocolate bars and plans to rebuild. The defeated could not comprehend it, but they could not deny it. The Americans had been soft-spoiled weak until tested, and then they had proven to be none of those things. They had proven to be exactly what they always were: practical, wealthy, organized, and utterly devastatingly effective. That was the truth Japan learned too late. And it was a truth written in fire.